Welcome back to the Ready for Merge show, the show about what code changes are ready for merge in Bitcoin and Ethereum. Thank you for joining me for another episode. For the last two episodes, we've been diving pretty deep into the Ethereum Hagota headliner proposals. And for this week's show, we're going to get back into Bitcoin land. We're going to be taking a step back and discussing some of the major updates that have been happening in both Bitcoin and Ethereum development. And one of the key topics that we're going to get into today is the topic of the post-quantum debates that have been happening in both the Bitcoin and the Ethereum developer communities. While developers are discussing the same threat, the responses and the strategies that are being discussed for addressing post-quantum, the post-quantum future is quite different. So we're going to get into that today. It's just me today. There's no guests for this week's show. But if you are tuning in live, please do chime in the chat with any questions that you might have, and we can make this show a bit more interactive. So let's get started with the biweekly brief. We're going to get started with Bitcoin today first. We haven't done one of these updates in a few weeks, as I was mentioning on the top of the show. And there has been some updates on Bitcoin Core development. So Bitcoin Core, as a refresher, is the software that most people use to run Bitcoin, to connect to the Bitcoin blockchain, to validate the Bitcoin blockchain. And Bitcoin Core, for the last couple months, has been gearing up for a new major release of their software. It's called Bitcoin Core V31. The Bitcoin Core V31 release is approaching its final stages of development. So a couple weeks ago, Bitcoin Core developers froze the features of Bitcoin Core V31, which means that the scope of that upgrade is pretty much finalized. Now developers are primarily focused on testing the release and stabilizing it for a hopeful final release next month in early April. And none of these changes in Bitcoin Core V31 are consensus breaking. They will not change any rules about transacting on Bitcoin. If anything, these are just optimizations and optional improvements geared towards making node operators, so any users that are running Bitcoin Core, hopefully make that experience just a bit easier and less error prone. I wrote a newsletter, not this week, but last week, that goes over all of the major features of Bitcoin Core V31. So I won't go into all of them in this show because that would just take too long, but I will link to that newsletter in the show notes if you want to learn more. And I'll also just highlight that one of the features that's going to go into Bitcoin Core V31 that I've covered previously on the show and in prior newsletters of BTC Before Light is cluster mempool. So a couple days ago, developers actually closed the tracking issue for cluster mempool because all of the necessary work needed to finish that project has been completed. As a refresher, cluster mempool primarily updates the logic and the reasoning behind Bitcoin nodes when it's processing unconfirmed transactions. So there's a portion of Bitcoin nodes' memory usage and storage usage that is dedicated towards processing and handling unconfirmed transactions in the Bitcoin network. And these nodes have a certain way of prioritizing and figuring out, okay, which transactions should be prioritized for propagation across Bitcoin's peer-to-peer networking layer, as well as estimating, okay, these are the transactions in the mempool that are likely to be included in a block, and these are the fees associated with that transaction. And so Cluster Mempool introduces a more sophisticated and advanced way for nodes to reason about the relationship between pending transactions in the Bitcoin mempool, so that related transactions can be grouped together. And the benefits that this allows are primarily better transaction fee estimation through the Bitcoin Core node, more accurate transaction prioritization from the mempool, and overall just more efficient management of the pending transaction pool of the mempool space that Bitcoin nodes carry. Cluster mempool, I will say, is as I mentioned, was a multi-year effort, but all of these benefits are something that Bitcoin Core node operators can look forward to finally being able to experience firsthand in the Bitcoin Core V31 release, because Cluster Mempool is one of the features that are going into V31. And there's a couple other kind of cool optimizations and features that are going into V31 as well. But for those, I do encourage you to check out the newsletter that I'll link into the show notes of today's episode if you want to learn more. Overall, none of the features going into V31 are all that controversial. By and large, the releases for Bitcoin Core aren't there's not a lot of fanfare. On the Ethereum side, every time there's an upgrade, I think there's a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy and perhaps debate. But on the Bitcoin Core side, there's not a lot of upgrades that actually impact Bitcoin's consensus. There are, however, several client releases that come out for Bitcoin Core throughout the year, and most of them go unnoticed. Most of them, I don't think many users and most Bitcoin stakeholders don't pay a ton of attention to these. But the anomaly, I would say, would have been the Bitcoin Core release that happened before V31, the one that happened in October, V30. That was an extremely controversial release and version of Bitcoin Core. And the debate and the discussion that is still happening with that release continues on. Although I will say it has lost quite a bit of steam since over the last couple months, but that is still a topic of discussion and a topic of controversy that I think is ongoing in the Bitcoin Core community. However, while that goes on, and while there's still a lot of disgruntled users about Bitcoin Core V30 and the features in that release, Bitcoin Core developers continue to plow onwards with their V31 release, which is expected to land sometime again in early April next month, because it doesn't have that many features that much of the community has spoken out about or is concerned about. I think it's going to be a fairly uncontroversial and fairly kind of like quiet release, I would say. I expect V31 to have all these great improvements like Cluster Mempool, but probably not to make and reach as many headlines as the V30 release did last year. That's the state of Bitcoin Core development. In parallel to all the work that's going into V31, I would say the main discussion point that the broader Bitcoin developer community is discussing and really focused on right now is the post-quantum future. So Bitcoin uses elliptic curve cryptography, a way of verifying transactions and signatures on Bitcoin that, in theory, a quantum computer could break and could potentially make insecure. So developers have known about this future and this threat of quantum computers for many years now, but with the incredible progress that is being made with AI and a couple of other breakthroughs that have been happening in the cryptography space, developers are more seriously talking about how to secure Bitcoin for a post-quantum future. And developers have been discussing different signature algorithms aside from elliptic curve cryptography that would be post-quantum secure to introduce to the Bitcoin protocol, and talking about, of course, ways in which to encourage and start the migration towards an alternative signature to an alternative cryptography that is post-quantum secure. And there's two ways in which this debate is really garnering the attention and the active discussion and debate of many developers in the community. The first is unsurprisingly extremely technical. There's a lot of discussions happening about which post-quantum secure signature algorithm should Bitcoin adopt. Let's compare their extremely technical qualifications, which are more efficient for aggregation and use on the Bitcoin network. And then the very practical kind of considerations of how these signatures, how the new cryptographic signature schemes would be rolled out on Bitcoin. How would they be enabled, and what are the different technical considerations of different migration strategies and paths? So on one hand, it's a very technical kind of debate of simply what is the better technical option here. But the harder and I would say more divisive topic of discussion related to post-quantum security for Bitcoin is primarily philosophical. And depending on how this debate goes, there will be ramifications on the technical side. And the primary philosophical question or a debate that's going on with Bitcoin on the post-quantum security topic is what developers should do about the lost coins of Bitcoin. So it is estimated that about 11 to 18% of Bitcoin's total supply, of its total 21 million coin supply, is irretrievable. It's not likely that that those coins are ever going to move because they haven't moved in over a decade. So these coins are the coins that, even if there was a new signature algorithm for which you could use to securely move your Bitcoin from one address to another, these are the coins that would never utilize those signatures, even if that option existed. And if quantum computing does become widespread and becomes available for commercial use, then it could be that a malicious actor uses a quantum computer to start moving those lost coins. And those coins could therefore become vulnerable to theft. And that could severely destabilize Bitcoin's security and also economic value, especially if those malicious actors just start to sell all of these coins on the open market. And so the discussion around what to do with lost coins has sparked quite a bit of debate. One of the discussion threads that I want to highlight, because I think it really speaks to the philosophical concerns around this topic, it's an email thread on the Bitcoin developers mailing list. It was started by a very prominent and longtime Bitcoin core developer, Peter Woolley. I hope I'm saying his last name right. But Peter, a couple of weeks ago, he opened up a discussion, sent an email to the Bitcoin developers mailing list, and asked the question basically, not even whether Bitcoin developers should change the rules of the protocol so that basically using elliptic curve cryptography becomes banned, so that no malicious actors could break Bitcoin in that way. He asked the question of, is it inevitable? Is it inevitable that for Bitcoin to survive a post-quantum future, Bitcoin must disable Bitcoin spending through elliptic curve cryptography? And Peters gives basically the argument that in this post-quantum future, yes, it is inevitable that Bitcoin developers will be forced to basically disable elliptic curve opcodes, ways in which you can spend Bitcoin through the elliptic curve cryptography and signature scheme, for Bitcoin to survive as a valuable protocol for peer-to-peer transfers of value. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but I want to share this quote that from his email. So Peter says, "quote If CRQCs or other EC breaks, which basically means if post-quantum computers that can break elliptic curve cryptography become reality, or just the fear about them becomes significant enough, I do believe that disabling elliptic curve opcodes will be necessary in any economically relevant surviving chain due to the millions of BTC that are unlikely to ever move." End quote. And this has caused, this continues to be a very active discussion point in the Bitcoin developer community. And it's basically discussing this trade-off between securing Bitcoin and ensuring that the security of Bitcoin is not negatively impacted by the vulnerability of these lost coins, um, versus the trade-off of property rights on Bitcoin and preserving the guarantees that users come to Bitcoin with. So there's this idea that in Bitcoin, if you were to buy Bitcoin and store it in a cold wallet and then bury it in the ground 10 years from now, you should still be able to retrieve those coins and move it, because those are your coins. And developers have no right. Some believe that developers have no right to change the rules of the protocol so that those assumptions change. The assumptions about what constitutes as allowing someone to be able to move their coins or not, those are assumptions that basically should not ever change, and that Bitcoin developers should hold as sacred in the Bitcoin protocol. There's a certain amount of like immutability that is associated with that aspect of the Bitcoin code base. So the debate is quite fierce, I would say, and I don't think that there's a clear consensus yet on how developers will move forward in terms of reconciling these two ideas of preserving the property rights of Bitcoin, but also preserving the economic value and security of the Bitcoin protocol. It's a conversation that it's great that developers are having now, and I will side. I do also personally think that it is inevitable that Bitcoin developers will have to address the issue of lost coins and do so by disabling the ability for a malicious actor to potentially move lost coins on Bitcoin and disable the elliptic curve opcodes. However, I think getting to that point is it's unclear to me, I guess, like how soon developers will be able to come to that realization. And with the unique threat with quantum computers is that it's so difficult for anyone to come to consensus about the timeline of this threat. And so I think there's the added just kind of concern of how quickly do developers need to really resolve this issue. And because it's not clear what the timeline for this threat is, there is this potential that the Bitcoin community may not come or reach a resolution on this really anytime soon. And so, yeah, it could be a discussion that just continues on for many years. But right now, currently, there's quite a lot of interest in it and active debate on it. On the Ethereum side, there is also a lot of discussion and active debate around post-quantum security, but the responses and the nature of the discussion is quite different from Bitcoin. On the Ethereum side, there is no debate at all about whether to change the rules of Ethereum, the consensus rules of Ethereum, in order to make Ethereum a post-quantum secure blockchain. Developers are constantly changing the rules of the Ethereum protocol. They do so at least once a year, if not multiple times a year. And so there's not really any concern about changing the assumptions or the property rights of the Ethereum protocol. On the Ethereum side, there is no sacred cows when it comes to what part of the protocol of Ethereum can or cannot change. Everything is fair game. So Ethereum developers have a lot more room and flexibility to adjust Ethereum, however it is that the uh, developers want and the community decides is the best path forward. And of course, that still leaves the same kind of technical discussions of what signature algorithms are most technically sound and most efficient for implementation on Ethereum. But on the more philosophical side, for the post-quantum debate on Ethereum, the question is not uh, regarding kind of the assumptions and the values that the Ethereum blockchain should uphold. On the Ethereum side, the main question is really regarding the question of scope and scope creep. So, Ethereum, alongside post quantum security, is trying to tackle several different long term initiatives, including radical levels of scaling the Ethereum blockchain, efforts to introduce pretty new and novel features like account abstraction, which would make user controlled accounts as flexible to use and program as smart contract accounts, as well as introduce unprecedented levels of privacy in user transactions, be it with encrypted mempool designs, as well as really make an effort to try and reduce the technical debt of Ethereum in radical ways and make Ethereum a simpler protocol that is more resilient and secure for the long term. And to this end, there has been a new development roadmap that has been released by an Ethereum Foundation researcher, a very high profile one whose name is Justin Drake. Usually, the Ethereum development roadmaps, there's about a new one that comes out every couple years from Vitalik, one of the co founders of Ethereum, who's still very involved in Ethereum development. But this one, the most recent one called the Strawman Roadmap, was released recently by Justin, and I'll link to it in today's show notes. But it illustrates just how the post-quantum roadmap is tied alongside these other parallel initiatives of privacy, scaling, reducing technical debt, introducing zero-knowledge cryptography and security, and enabling account abstraction, et cetera, radically improving the user experience of Ethereum. And so all of all of the effort that's going into post-quantum is also being overlaid with these other initiatives. And so much so that it's not just the development roadmap for post-quantum that developers are trying to figure out how and when this happens alongside other initiatives. There's on the level of singular proposals, singular features that are trying to address not just the issue of post-quantum security, Ethereum's post-quantum security, but also address a bunch of other ongoing issues or areas of improvement for Ethereum. So the one proposal that I'm thinking about is Frame. And we did discuss Frame a little bit on last week's Ready for Merge episode where we talked about the Hagota headliners. As background, Hagota is the Ethereum upgrade that developers will start working on roughly. Developers are thinking either later this year, but most likely early next. So the next immediate Ethereum upgrade is called Glamsterdam. That's the upgrade that developers are working on and implementing now. But while they're doing that in parallel, they're also working on scoping out the upgrade after Glamsterdam, which is Hagota. And developers are currently discussing what major features to prioritize for that upgrade. One of the proposals is Frame. And Frame is intended to do several different things. It introduces basically a general framework for users to dictate the way that their transactions and should be verified. So rather than forcing transactions from user-controlled accounts to be verified through the one cryptographic signature scheme of the ECDSA elliptic curve cryptography, using elliptic curve cryptography, which again could be is vulnerable to being broken and made insecure by post-quantum computers in the future. Frame would allow users to be able to dictate their own cryptographic scheme, whatever that may be it a cryptographic scheme that is post-quantum secure or simply more user-friendly, as not many, I would say, most people in this world are not super familiar with handling private keys and understanding kind of the security around public and private key addresses and whatnot. So, Frame is a proposal that would introduce native account abstraction to Ethereum. It would introduce potential ways in which users could start to experiment with post quantum secure accounts, and ideally just open up a whole new a whole new realm of possibilities for what types of applications and wallet designs could happen if wallet developers and also users themselves just had free reign to specify in their transaction exactly how they want that transaction to be verified. And so there's quite a bit of strong support for Frame. Vitalik is one of the supporters, as well as several other researchers from the Ethereum Foundation. But there are concerns about Frame that it is a bit too general because it's not trying to solve one particular problem on Ethereum, but rather multiple, and could result in these very unforeseen use cases and unforeseen new types of applications on Ethereum. It's hard to evaluate for some whether this is a proposal that needs to be prioritized now or whether there's simpler ways to go about addressing every single one of what Frame tries to do, but with very targeted code changes. So rather than having Frame address account abstraction, post-quantum migration strategies all at once, introducing more simpler ways to just enable more flexible ownership of and control over user-controlled accounts, and then separately, perhaps another feature that simply enables like one particular type of post-quantum secure cryptographic signature scheme. So there's a debate. There's a debate that's ongoing on Ethereum of whether Frame should be prioritized for Hagota. And I think it speaks to the larger debate going on of how exactly to tackle post-quantum security. And it's very clear that on the topic of Frame, but also on the topic of post-quantum security in general, for Ethereum, it's part and parcel with many other initiatives that Ethereum developers are trying to tackle at the same time. And there's active discussions going on of scope creep, of whether trying to tackle post-quantum and account abstraction and all these other initiatives at the same time is just too much. And concerns about whether or not those initiatives should be scaled back. So that really is, I would say, the gist of how the post-quantum debates look and sound very different in the Bitcoin developer community versus the Ethereum developer community. On the Ethereum developer community side, the question is really about what can we do alongside post-quantum security that impacts how the rollout and the migration of those features happen. Whereas on the Bitcoin side, the discussion is very much focused on just post-quantum security, but to what extent the values of that protocol and the promises or the assumptions that users have when interacting with Bitcoin, to what extent those assumptions should still hold, even when discussing pretty major and unprecedented threats to Bitcoin and public blockchain security in general. I try and do these updates on Bitcoin and Ethereum, just giving you the high level of what you really need to know about the evolution of these protocols every 2 weeks. But sometimes other more interesting topics get in the way, and that's what happened in the last 2 weeks. I wanted to make a note as we wrap up today's show about the next 2 weeks that's coming up for Ready for Merge. I am going to be releasing 2 more Meet the Devs interviews. These are one-on-one interviews with full-time protocol developers that I do to educate listeners and also educate myself on what protocol developers do, what motivates protocol development, and just the governance behind Bitcoin and Ethereum. So these next two Meet the Devs are profiles of two Ethereum protocol developers. I record them very early on. My premium subscribers for my Substack may have already listened to them, but I'm going to be releasing them publicly for the next two Ready for Merge episodes. So there's actually 4 that I haven't released, and I thought, again, as I've done in prior episodes, I thought it'd be good to source from my listeners which of the remaining Meet the Devs interviews you guys want to hear first. So there's basically 4 that I still have, and I'll be releasing 2 over the next 2 weeks. One of them covers how a full-time Google engineer became an Ethereum developer. The second one is how an altcoin trader, a BNB altcoin trader, became an Ethereum developer. Third one is how a Bloomberg engineer became an Ethereum developer. And then the final one is how a Canadian Armed Forces veteran became an Ethereum developer. So if you have preferences or want to if you are curious to know about one of these stories or 2 of these stories more than the others, please do let me know. I'll have a poll out on X and all the channels in which you're listening to this podcast. Please vote and let me know what you want to listen and hear first for next week, and I'll be sure to prioritize those. I personally think I might prioritize the Canadian Armed Forces one because that one was a very good conversation, and I'm Canadian, so that seems the one that I'm leaning towards, but I also want to hear from you guys. So chime in on the post-recording, the post-show poll with your thoughts, and you can help me decide what to prioritize. Then on the week of the 23rd this month, I'll be back with a new biweekly brief. Again, just covering the Bitcoin and Ethereum development updates like I did today. So that's what's coming up. Thank you guys so much for joining me for another episode of Ready for Merge. I'm your host, Christine D. Kim. Please do tune in again next week for a new episode and stay ahead of the curve on Bitcoin and Ethereum protocol development with me. Bye, everyone.